After a fatal thing happened to King William II while he was hunting in the woods, his crown and titles should have gone to his older brother, Robert Curthose, who was his heir. But Robert was far away on a crusade. It would be a long time before he heard of his brother's death, and an even longer time before he was able to return to England and claim his throne. So instead of the crown going to the rightful heir, who was far away, it went to a prince who was very nearby, so near that he had been on the very same hunting trip that had killed the king. Wasting no time in making the best of the situation, Prince Henry rode fast for the royal treasury. Although Robert Curthose was far away, he still had supporters in England. Supporters who, if given the chance, would try and secure the throne and hold it for Robert's return. Prince Henry wasn't going to allow that. All of his life he had been the excluded son of William the Conqueror. Unlike his brothers, Henry had inherited no lands upon the death of his father. While his eldest brother, Robert, got the ancestral Duchy of Normandy, and William inherited the Kingdom of England, Henry was merely left with a pile of cash. Yet, despite this, of all the sons of William the Conqueror, it would be Henry who would go on to have the most successful career and the most enduring legacy. This is the story of Henry I of England. This is the retelling. With the sudden, possibly accidental death of his brother the king, Prince Henry must have seen the writing on the wall. If he ever wanted to be king, or much of anything at all beyond simply a prince, he needed to act fast and decisively. With no lands of his own to retreat to and no vast armies yet loyal to his cause, Henry went for the only other type of power that mattered: the money. But securing the treasury wasn't as simple as just showing up and claiming it. The treasury belonged to the king, not whichever member of the royal family claimed it. What Henry was doing was ostensibly a coup. In Winchester, Robert's supporters tried to halt Prince Henry before he could seize the treasury, but by now it would have been clear to all what was happening. Questions were raised about Henry's claim to the throne. What right did he, the last-born son of King William the Conqueror, have on the Kingdom of England? Why should any of the barons support him and not the designated heir, Robert? For this, Henry issued a strange counter-argument. At the time, the standard rule of practice regarding succession was centered around the ancient right of primogeniture, which meant that the eldest child was the one who inherited all the lands and titles, or at the very least, inherited the lion's share. Henry, however, had a clever counter for this when he put forth the argument of porphyrogeniture, meaning born in the purple. Purple being the color reserved for royalty. The argument there being that he, Henry, had been the only one of William the Conqueror's sons to be born to a sitting king and queen, and therefore his claim to the throne was stronger than that of his older brother, who had been born before their father was a king. It may have been a slightly dubious claim, but for the barons opposing Henry, it soon became clear that there was little they could do to stop the young prince. Primogeniture or porphyrogeniture, the fact was that the heir, Robert Curthose, was far, far away, and Henry was not. Those barons loyal to Robert could fight and die defending his claim, or they could go the way of everyone else and support Henry instead. Before long, Henry occupied Winchester, and he had control of the treasury. On the 5th of August, 1100, Henry was crowned King of England in Westminster. 3 days prior, he had merely been a landless prince. Now, he was a king. Henry had played his hand, and he had played it well. When it came to being a king, Henry was no slouch. He immediately framed his reign as a stabilizing one. Where his older brother's time on the throne had been a loose, debauched reign, his would be an effective, faithful, and modern government focused on restoring law, order, and a sense of normalcy over the restless, wounded realm. Those were lofty promises for the time, but Henry backed them up. To ensure good relations with his neighbors to the north, Henry quickly married a Scottish princess, Matilda, with whom he would go on to have 2 children with. This drew a stark contrast between Henry and his predecessor, who had never married or had any children. Henry, on the other hand, was never shy of women. Throughout the course of his life, he would take a number of mistresses and fathered at least 20 illegitimate children, some of whom were recognized and given prominent places in court or high society. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Henry's older brother, Robert Curthose, was not too pleased about having his kingdom stolen out from under him while he was away on a crusade, and he soon formed an opposition party across the sea from England in his Duchy of Normandy. Robert's claims on the English throne may have been strong, and his reasons may have been good, but unfortunately for him, he lacked greatness. Though he was skilled in some ways, he was a fine warrior, for example, he was also severely lacking in others. He was lazy, impressionable, and when it came to making decisions, he usually made the wrong one. He was an unlucky man who too often tended to disappoint. His very nickname, for example, Curthose, or Short Stockings, was a reference to his stubby legs and short stature. Robert's resistance to Henry's claim as king may have been justified, but it was also doomed to fail. In a war against his brother, Robert stood little chance, and in the year 1106 he was defeated in battle and he was captured. Henry and Robert had never been close brothers. In fact, they knew each other far better as enemies than they did as brothers. Years earlier, in 1077, Henry and William Rufus played a cruel prank on Robert when they doused him with the contents of a chamber pot. Robert had been so badly offended by this that he demanded his father reprimand the two princes, and when the conqueror did nothing, Robert rebelled against his father and his brothers. While that rebellion ended amicably enough, this later one would not. Henry seized the Duchy of Normandy as his own, and Robert was imprisoned for the rest of his very long life. With Robert and his supporters dealt with, England entered a new state of peace and stability. Without any wars or insurrections to worry about, Henry began his work on restoring law and order in the realm. In this, he was ruthlessly effective. To do away with rampant crime and untried court cases, King Henry reordered the courts, giving rise to traveling justices that would tour the realm, hearing criminal cases and distributing justice on the king's behalf. This gave rise to the so-called new man in government. These were men who had earned their place through merit and hard work, rather than receiving them as gifts or rewards for service. In addition to these new men, Henry also introduced the office of the Exchequer, a royal officer tasked with the keeping and accounting of the kingdom's treasury. This new role proved to be so important and so successful that it is still around to this day. Henry was a massively talented administrator and reformer. He reformed and refined law, justice, and even coinage, all with the steady, predictable hand that the kingdom had been missing for so long. No longer was the realm ruled simply by fear or by rewarding a collection of the king's closest friends. Instead, it was beginning to take the shape of a kingdom ruled by law and by order. That isn't to say that Henry was a gentle man. He wasn't. By any modern standard, he would be considered a brutal and vengeful tyrant, a thief, a killer, and a mutilator. But by the standards of the day, Henry was quite fair. One of the practices he did away with, for example, was the habit of pillaging nearby lands and villages whenever royal court was passing through. No more could the king's men simply wander into a settlement and take whatever they wanted whenever the king was passing by. Henry also did work to improve England's relationship with the church, which had been a strained and tested union under the reign of William II. King William II had not been a holy man. He had mocked at the church and disrespected its officers. When William II died his untimely death in the woods, there would have been few holy men in England, or indeed the rest of the world, that would have mourned his passing. Henry, however, was a bridge builder. Though he wasn't an overly pious man himself, King Henry worked hard to mend relations with the church, taking an active role in the selection of English bishops and archbishops. Although King Henry was no saint, he was far more favorable to the church, and as a result, he was looked on far more favorably by them than was his predecessor. As the years rolled on, so too did King Henry's successes. By November of the year 1120, it must have seemed as though all was going quite well for Henry. He had just defeated the French in a war, his realms were secure and his barons were content. His wife, Matilda, had died 2 years earlier, and that must have been upsetting, but as we have seen, Henry was not a one-woman man, and he may have found solace in the company of his mistresses. As he already had an heir, and a grown and beloved one at that, King Henry saw no reason to remarry. By November of 1120, all was going quite well for King Henry. But before the end of that month, all of that was going to change. On the 20th of November, 1120, after concluding peace talks with the French, King Henry I, his son, Prince William Adelin, and their combined retinues were in the port of Barfleur, preparing to leave France and return home to England. The settlement was alive with energy and activity. It was a time of celebration. With the French bested and everyone set to return home, there would have been a sense of celebration about the place. People would have turned out in droves to see the king pass through, and here he was with his son, the prince, and more of their family besides. The Prince William Adelin and his entourage were very much the celebrities of their day. William, named after his famous grandfather, the Conqueror, was a talented, handsome, spoiled young man of 17 years. He was also arrogant, brash, and overly self-confident, but that is to be expected of young princes. As the only legitimate son of Henry I and the Scottish Princess Matilda, William was as blue-blooded as a man could get. In short, he was a perfect prince who, as the only son and heir, would have lived an extraordinary life of privilege and wealth. And the story was no different on the 25th of November, 1120. In Barfleur, the prince was loaned the finest ship available for the crossing back to England. It was a large, new, and beautifully painted longship. While other vessels moored nearby were the drab color of wood, this ship was painted white. The White Ship, as it was creatively called, was the perfect ship for the young prince. It was new, state-of-the-art, beautifully made and decorated. It was large, big enough to carry at least 200 passengers, their luggage, and a crew of 50. Powered by a single mast and a square sail, the White Ship also had oars on either side for even more power. It was the perfect ship for the perfect prince. Aboard the ship, the prince and his entourage continued their celebrations. They ordered wine to be brought aboard, and it wasn't long before all of those aboard the White Ship, including her captain and crew, were all drunk. As the day wore on, a favorable wind from the south came up, and some of the other ships moored near Barfleur began to cast off for the crossing. The White Ship, however, did not cast off. There, the partying continued. Packed full of young, wealthy, beautiful people, it would have been quite the scene. The equivalent today of billionaire and millionaire heirs and heiresses partying aboard a super yacht. There would have been music and entertainment. Cups were raised and songs were sung. When the wine ran out, more was bought and brought aboard. And as the day turned to evening, still the White Ship did not cast off. By evening, the sensible and sober King Henry was ready to cast off. His partying days were long behind him, and so, with a farewell to his son and the revelers aboard the White Ship, King Henry cast off with an evening wind at his back, carrying him across the channel. As the evening turned to night, the partying aboard the White Ship carried on, and as other ships with more sober captains set off, the White Ship, with its inebriated captain and crew, stayed behind, drinking and making merry. This was nothing to worry about, at least according to the captain of the White Ship. By his account, the white ship was fast enough to catch up to those other ships that had cast off earlier in the evening, and it was even fast enough to overtake the king's own vessel. Those aboard could continue drinking and partying into the night if they wanted to, and they'd still be faster than the other ships. This might sound like reckless, drunken boasting, and it was. It was plain to see, even to some of those aboard the white ship, that the inebriated state of the captain and his crew was more than a little dangerous. As the celebrations wore on, one of the passengers, the prince's cousin Stephen of Blois, left the ship on the excuse of suffering from an upset stomach. Following this example, a few other passengers quietly disembarked to find other ships to carry them home. Back aboard the white ship, a group of priests arrived to bless the vessel for its crossing, but they were harassed and sent away by those aboard the ship. They didn't need any blessing. Late into the night, the drunken sailors aboard the white ship prepared to cast off. The anchor was brought up and the sail let down, and under the light of the moon, the white ship surged off into the dark and choppy waters of the English Channel. The ship was fast. With the sail full of wind and the broad-backed sailors hauling on the oars, the ship scythed out into the harbor with a determined pace. Sadly, it didn't make it very far. A few minutes after setting off, before the white ship was even out of the harbor, it smashed into a rocky outcropping that juts from the water and that can still be seen today. It was a well-known hazard of the day. As the wooden prow of the white ship crashed into the rocky outcropping, there would have been a tremendous crash, unlike any other sound. The hundreds of people aboard the ship would have screamed and panicked, and all of this would have only gotten worse as cold water began to surge into the ship, and it began to sink. Drunken sailors floundered about the dark ship, desperately trying to bail water out. Knights and noblemen screamed and cursed as they were swept overboard. Noble ladies cried out as cold, rushing water carried them off into the deep dark. Meanwhile, the Prince William was bundled away by his bodyguards and thrown into the ship's lifeboat. As the prince was rowed quickly away from the sinking carnage, he heard dozens of voices screaming and crying, some of them calling out to him, begging for him to come back for them. One of the voices that echoed out from the darkness was that of William's own half-sister, the Countess of Perche. Unable to stomach the thought of leaving her behind, the prince ordered the lifeboat be turned around and his half-sister be rescued. It was a fatal decision. As the lifeboat neared the Countess, it was quickly swamped by dozens of other desperate survivors clamoring aboard. In the next moments, the lifeboat too was upended, and Prince William Adelin was cast into the sea, and he drowned. The contemporary chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, with a particular lack of grace, wrote of Prince William's death. Instead of wearing a crown of gold, his head was broken open by the rocks of the sea. Of the over 200 people on board the ship that night, there was only one survivor, a humble butcher who had only boarded the white ship to collect a payment when the ship was cast off with him aboard. When the ship had gone down, he had wrapped himself in hides and clung to bits of the shipwreck throughout the night. The sinking of the white ship was a disaster that drowned an entire generation of the kingdom's nobility and spelled doom for the Norman dynasty of kings. Across the Channel in England, King Henry had arrived without issue, completely unaware that anything bad had befallen those aboard the white ship. Even after news reached England, still the king was kept in the dark. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to tell him. Finally, a young boy was recruited for the task. Falling at the king's feet and weeping, the boy told Henry what had befallen his son and the others aboard the white ship. Prince William was not the only one of Henry's children to die in that disaster. He'd also lost his daughter Matilda, the Countess who had called out to the prince as he rode away, and one of his sons, Richard of Lincoln. King Henry, unable to bear the news, fell to the ground in anguish. He never smiled again. The disaster that was the sinking of the White Ship largely defined the second half of King Henry's reign, which was largely dominated by the question of who would succeed the king. In need of a male heir, Henry remarried, but despite the virility of his younger years, this current endeavor proved fruitless, and the couple remained childless. With the death of Prince William Adelin and the inability to father any new legitimate children, King Henry only had one remaining legitimate child, a daughter called Matilda, or Maud. When Maud had only been 8 years old, she had been married off to the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, making her an empress, a title that she proudly kept for the rest of her life. The marriage between Maud and the Emperor remained childless, and the Emperor died in 1125, at which point Maud returned to England. In the years since the sinking of the White Ship, King Henry had failed to father another legitimate son, and the time was coming to declare a clear successor. One candidate was Henry's likable nephew Stephen of Blois, the very same Stephen who had departed the White Ship before it left Barfleur. The other candidate was Empress Maud. By 1126, Henry had made up his mind, and at Christmas of that year he gathered the barons of the realm to swear an oath to support his daughter, the Empress Maud, and any male children she may have as his heir. To this, the barons agreed. King Henry then arranged a second marriage between his daughter and Geoffrey of Anjou, the son of the Count of Anjou, thus securing a peace with the Angevins. It was a peace that had already been secured years before with the marriage between Prince William Adelin and his bride Matilda of Anjou, but that had fallen apart when William drowned. The Empress Maud was not too pleased to be reduced to marrying the son of a count. She had, after all, been empress. Besides, Geoffrey was only 13 years old. She was 25. As a woman of her time, however, the question of who Maud was going to marry was not up to her. Empress Maud and Geoffrey of Anjou were wed on the 17th of June, 1128. They never liked each other. Despite this, the couple did manage to have 3 children who were all boys. The first of these sons, born in 1133, was called Henry, after his grandfather. By 1135, King Henry would have perhaps felt that he had made the right decision regarding the succession crisis. His barons had agreed to support his daughter, and by then she had 2 male sons of her own, ensuring that there would not be another crisis of succession. In November of 1135, after some military campaigning against rebels, King Henry went on a hunting expedition. Shortly thereafter, he fell ill, and against his doctor's orders, he ate a surfeit of lampreys, whereupon his sickness grew much worse. Soon it became clear that the king was going to die. On the 1st of December, 1135, King Henry I died. If the fallout from the sinking of the White Ship had been bad, the death of King Henry I and what was to come next would be nothing short of disastrous. Faced with the reality of a woman leading the nation, many of the barons who had sworn to support Empress Maud now turned their backs on their oaths and instead went in search of a male claimant to the throne, Stephen of Blois. England was then plunged into years of civil war that was so brutal, unpredictable, and lawless that it would simply come to be known as the anarchy. It was a time when it was popularly said that Christ and his saints slept. But that is a story for another time. Hey, thanks for watching the video, and thanks to those of you who make it this far. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or leaving a comment to help the channel grow. I'll see you in the next one.